I had never believed in omens or strange feelings that people get before something awful happens. But if I had, I would have turned around the moment I pulled into the cracked parking lot of the small roadside motel just outside Amarillo, Texas, where the flickering neon sign buzzed like an insect in the thick evening air, and the sky looked bruised, as if the sun had set with a scowl. I was on a solo cross-country road trip to clear my head after a year that had shredded my sanity like tissue in the wind, a breakup that left me questioning everything, the sudden death of my father, and a job that devoured my soul one micromanaged email at a time. So when I saw that tired, skeletal building with a vacancy sign that sputtered more than it glowed, something in me, some exhausted, foolish part of me, thought, this is fine. And I pulled in without thinking, checked in with the clerk, who looked like he'd crawled out of a tomb and said maybe 6 words total, before sliding me a rusted key on a ring stained with something I didn't want to identify, and walked to room 6, second door from the end, beside a vending machine humming like it held back secrets instead of snacks. The room smelled like mildew and dust-covered memories, and I didn't even want to look at the sheets too long, so I threw my bag on the lone chair with a spring sticking out like a hungry claw, took a piss in the bathroom with flickering lights, and a cracked mirror above the stained sink, then dropped onto the bed in my clothes with a sigh that felt too big for my chest, trying to convince myself this was just a place to crash, just a stop before the next long stretch of highway, until around 2:37 a.m., when I woke up to a sound that didn't belong in this world or any other, a soft tapping that felt wet, if sound could be wet, like fingers dipped in something thick tapping glass from the other side, and I lay there frozen, because the sound wasn't coming from the window where I'd drawn the heavy, dust-caked curtain, but from the mirror in the bathroom, the one I'd barely glanced into earlier, and as the seconds ticked by in my skull like a drumbeat from hell, I realized the tapping was slow, deliberate, almost patient, like whoever or whatever was doing it knew I was awake and was waiting for me to come look. I told myself not to. Told myself to just stay in bed and ride it out. But something, curiosity, stupidity, that damn human compulsion to stare into the abyss even when it's staring back, got me up and creeping toward the bathroom in the dark, heart hammering so loud I was sure it would wake the dead. And as I got closer, the tapping stopped, and there was this awful pause, like the silence you get before something terrible happens in a horror movie. And when I stepped into the bathroom and faced the mirror, my breath caught in my throat because there in the glass was a reflection that wasn't mine. Same bathroom, same flickering light overhead, but no me. Just a man in a suit too clean for this place, standing perfectly still, head tilted slightly, as if curious or amused, with a pale face that looked like it hadn't seen sunlight in decades, and eyes that were all wrong. Black, not like pupils, but like holes punched into the world. And I stumbled back, heart going supersonic, but the thing in the mirror stayed where it was. And then it smiled, slow and deliberate, teeth too sharp, too numerous, and the light above me buzzed louder, popped and went out, plunging the room into darkness so thick it felt like hands tightening around my throat. And when I scrambled, back into the main room, slamming the bathroom door behind me, the tapping started again, faster now, more urgent, and I swear to God it wasn't coming just from the mirror anymore, but from the inside of my own skull, echoing like the bastard was in there with me. And I grabbed my bag, ran barefoot across the gravel parking lot without even checking out, got in my car, and drove like hell was licking my tires, didn't stop for hours, didn't even slow down. And every time I glanced in the rearview mirror, I saw nothing. But every time I blinked, I could still see that face and the smile. And when I finally reached a diner at dawn and went to the bathroom to splash water on my face, I made the mistake of looking into the mirror, and he was there behind me just for a second, smiling. I don't remember much after seeing that face in the diner mirror, just that I screamed, loud enough that the elderly man pouring coffee and the waitress wiping down the counter both froze mid-motion and stared at me like I'd brought a storm in with me. And I ran out without ordering a thing, my appetite gone, my nerves scorched, because what I saw wasn't just a hallucination or leftover fear playing tricks on my exhausted brain. It was the same man, the same too-smooth suit, the same jagged mouth and abyssal eyes. And the worst, Part was that he didn't look surprised or angry, or even particularly interested, just satisfied like this was all part of some slow-burning plan I wasn't even aware I'd signed up for. And as I drove, I kept the mirrors tilted down and my eyes glued to the road. But no matter how far I went, miles of highway, through towns, so small they didn't show up on GPS, past cornfields and gas stations and roadside motels that made my skin crawl, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was behind me, not following in a car but clinging to me, to my reflection, to my very presence. And by the time I reached Colorado, I'd gone almost 36 hours without sleep, my mind fraying at the edges like an old sweater. And I started noticing weird things, reflections not lining up, mirrors taking just a second too long to catch up to my movements, and sometimes, even in shiny surfaces like chrome or a puddle of gasoline, I'd catch that figure, just a flash, standing behind me, never moving, never blinking, always watching. And then the dreams started, thick, oppressive dreams where I'd wake up in a room with no doors or windows, walls covered in mirrors from floor to ceiling, all fogged over like someone had been breathing heavily just moments before. And in each one, somewhere out of view, that thing would whisper my name, not aloud, but in my head. A voice that felt like oil sliding over my brain. And I'd wake, up screaming, drenched in sweat, hands clutched around my own throat. And after a week of this, I drove to the one place I thought could help, an old occult bookstore in Denver that my ex once dragged me into on a lark, where the owner, a woman named Esme who looked like a crow given human form, sat behind the counter reading tarot for herself and muttered without looking up, "You brought something with you." Before I even opened my mouth, and when I told her everything, spilled it all out in a torrent of panic and desperation, she didn't laugh or look skeptical or ask me if I was on drugs. She just nodded slowly and led me into the back room where she pulled a dusty, leather-bound tome off a shelf and flipped through until she found a sketch of a figure that turned my blood to slush. The Watcher in the Glass, a spirit, or demon, depending who you asked, that attaches itself to people through reflective surfaces drawn to pain, grief and unresolved trauma like a leech to blood. And once it marked you, it didn't stop, not until you were either insane or gone, and the only way to break the bond was to confront it directly, in its realm, which meant willingly entering the mirror, finding its core and severing the tether. But she warned me in a voice that barely concealed her fear that no one had ever come back quite right if they came back at all. And I should have left, should have run. But I couldn't keep living like this. So she set up a ritual that night using an antique mirror framed in bone and wrapped in runes that smelled like old rain. And as the final candle was lit, I felt the air go heavy, thick like syrup in my lungs, and the reflection in the mirror began to boil, like the glass itself was a membrane being peeled back. And before I could flinch, it pulled me in, no wind-up, no warning. Just yanked into the dark, and I landed hard on a floor made of glass that cracked beneath my weight, but didn't break. And I was surrounded by infinite reflections of myself, except not all of them were me. Some had no eyes, others smiled when I didn't. And one, dear God, one had the face of the man from the motel, and when it stepped forward, all the others froze like it was the conductor of this twisted symphony, and it spoke. Not with words, but with thoughts that felt like rusted knives scraping across my mind, telling me that it fed on fear, on sorrow, that I had been chosen the night I stood in front of that mirror in room 6, and now I belonged to it. But I didn't. Run, not this time. I remembered what Esme had said, that I had to confront it, and so I stepped forward too, heart roaring in my ears, and I said its name. Atzarel, the Watcher of many faces. And something in the air cracked, like glass under pressure, and suddenly all the reflections around me shattered, every shard flying toward the entity, slicing through it as it howled with a sound that I still hear in my dreams. And the next thing I knew, I was lying on the floor of the bookstore, Esme shaking me, tears in her eyes, whispering, "You did it. You did it." Over and over, and for the first time in weeks when I looked in the mirror, it was just me, just me, no figure, no shadows, no delayed movements. But to this day, I keep every mirror in my home covered when I sleep. I never stay in motels. And sometimes, just sometimes, when I pass a reflective surface out of the corner of my eye, I swear, I see a man in a suit watching, watching. I used to think lakes were peaceful, calming even, especially in the early morning when the mist rolls across the surface, like a breath held in by the world. Everything still, everything quiet, like the water itself is asleep and dreaming. But that was before the summer I spent with my cousin Thomas at our grandfather's cabin deep in the Adirondacks. A cabin that sat just yards from a lake so old and secluded it didn't even have a name on the local maps, just a blotch of blue in the woods surrounded by topographical lines and warnings about poor reception and rough trails. But our grandfather loved the place, used to call it God's Eye because of how still and round the lake looked when viewed from the cliffside. And that year, after his funeral, it felt like some unspoken agreement between me and Thomas that we'd go out there. Maybe for closure, maybe because we didn't want the place sold off, or maybe because there was something in both of us that couldn't resist the idea of being alone with our memories. Just two guys in their 20s. No cell service, no expectations, just the wind, the trees, and that dark, silent water. But right from the start, something felt wrong, not overtly. Nothing obvious like a bear or a broken generator. More like a constant pressure just below the surface of everything. Like the forest was listening. Like the lake wasn't sleeping, just pretending. And our first night there, as we sat on the dock, drinking cheap beer and trading stories about Grandpa. His stubbornness, his fishing superstitions, his habit of talking to the lake like it was a person. I saw Thomas freeze mid-sentence, his face pale in the moonlight, and when I asked what was wrong, he just shook his head and said, "Did you hear that?" And of course I didn't, because all I could hear was the wind and the occasional creak of the dock. But Thomas swore he heard a voice, whispering his name, soft and low. Not an echo, not the wind, but a voice, coming from the water. And I laughed. It off told him he'd had too much beer, probably just his imagination. But inside something prickled because earlier, when I was unpacking upstairs, I could have sworn I heard footsteps behind me. Slow, deliberate ones, on creaky old floorboards that no wind could have moved. But there was no one there, and I shook it off, blaming the weird atmosphere, the fatigue from travel, the weight of grief. But that night, as I lay in the loft staring up at the exposed rafters, I heard it too, faint at first, like someone speaking from underwater, too muffled to understand, but definitely there. And when I sat up and looked toward the lake through the window, I saw movement, not ripples or fish or a breeze, shapes long and thin, gliding just beneath the surface. And when I blinked, they were gone. And I told myself it was just shadows, just a dream. But each night it got worse. The voices got clearer, closer, and soon they weren't just whispering names, they were telling stories, fragments of lives that felt old and broken, stories of loss, betrayal, drowning, always drowning. And I started waking up with water on my sheets, small puddles, around my feet like I'd stepped out of a lake in my sleep. And Thomas, he got worse fast. He stopped sleeping, stopped talking unless it was to mutter to himself about things he couldn't explain, old shipwrecks and ghost towns. And one night I found him standing waist-deep in the lake, eyes wide and unfocused, mumbling, "They're here. They're all here." And when I pulled him out, his skin was ice-cold, lips blue, but he swore he didn't remember getting in. Said he woke up to a voice that sounded like Grandpa calling him from the dock. And after that, we tried to leave, packed our bags at dawn and started down the trail. But no matter how far we hiked, we couldn't find the road. Just more trees, more paths that led back to the lake. And when we tried using a compass, it spun in circles. Useless, and we realized slowly, horrifyingly, that we were trapped, not physically. We could move, walk, breathe, but something was keeping us tethered, like a spider pulling its web tighter. And on the fifth night, the dreams turned violent. Dreams of drowning with hands dragging us down, cold fingers around our ankles, and Thomas woke up screaming, deep red scratches across his chest like he'd been clawed from within. And then the whispers turned to cries, not for help, but for company. Like the lake was lonely and we were the answer to that loneliness. And the final straw came when I found an old photograph tucked behind a loose plank in the dock. A black and white shot of our grandfather as a young man, standing with a group of 6 others, all smiling by the lake, but on the back, in faded handwriting, were the words, Only one made it out, and I knew then that Grandpa had never told us the whole truth, that something happened here, something buried beneath decades of silence, and we were repeating it, like players in a cursed play. And that night, I sat by the dock, flashlight off, and waited, and sure enough, the water shifted, rising unnaturally, and from its depths came voices, not just whispers now, but pleas, laughter, screams, and I finally saw them, faces beneath the surface, staring up, unmoving, eyes wide with hunger or grief or maybe both. And in the center, a hand broke the surface, long and pale and dripping, reaching toward me, and I don't know what possessed me. Maybe it was exhaustion or madness or something else entirely, but I reached back, and the moment our fingers touched, I saw everything. The night Grandpa and his friends dove into the lake on a dare, the accident, the thing they woke up that refused to let go, and how he alone made it out, changed, haunted, and spent the rest of his life trying to keep the lake's secrets buried. But secrets, like bodies, don't stay buried forever. And now they had us. 2 more names for the water to whisper. When the lake touched me, when that pale, dripping hand met mine, it wasn't just a physical sensation. It was like I'd been pulled into a second skin, one woven of every nightmare ever lost to time, every soul that had sunk beneath those waters, every scream swallowed by the surface, and every promise broken to the things that lurked below. And I saw it all, not with my eyes, but with something deeper, like a part of me had been peeled away, my mind made translucent so the visions could seep in unfiltered. An old settlement beneath where the lake now sat. Cabins swallowed by water over 100 years ago. A church bell half buried in silt still tolling without sound. A preacher with eyes burned black by fire who whispered prayers not meant for human ears. And then faces, hundreds of them, all wide-eyed and bloated, floating just beneath the lake's skin, some from decades ago, some more recent, mouths open as though they were still trying to scream or sing or breathe. But most haunting was the feeling I got from them, not anger, not pain, but longing, like they didn't even realize they were dead, like they were waiting for something. Someone, and maybe that someone was me, or maybe it had always been Grandpa, and now with him gone the lake had turned its attention to us as some twisted form of inheritance. And when I snapped out of that vision, I was lying on the dock with Thomas kneeling over me, face pale, eyes bloodshot, muttering something about a girl in the lake. A girl he said had been following him in dreams since we got there, whispering his name from behind the trees, from beneath the water, from inside the walls of the cabin. And I knew then we were running out of time, that the lake had started claiming us in pieces, first through dreams, then touches, then thoughts, until nothing of us would remain but shadows echoing through, the pines and ripples that never faded. And I tried to ground myself in logic, tried to think like someone in a horror movie who survives. Stay awake. Don't isolate. Don't follow the whispers. But the lake was smarter than that, older, and it knew how to twist the rules, because the next night, Thomas was gone when I woke up. Just gone. His bed empty, his boots still by the door, and the front door left wide open like it had been inviting something or someone in. And I ran out to the dock, heart pounding, screaming his name. And there, far out in the mist-shrouded water, I saw him standing on the lake like it was solid ground, bare-chested, eyes closed, arms at his side, and I screamed until my throat was raw, but he didn't move, didn't flinch, didn't even seem alive. And then, one by one, hands rose around him from the water, pale hands, dozens of them, each taking hold of him slowly, gently, like a mother cradling a sleeping child, and they pulled him under without a splash, without a ripple. And I ran into the trees and didn't stop until I collapsed, hours later, on the edge of a road I didn't recognize. And someone found me. An old man in a pickup truck who said he knew that lake, said his brother had gone missing there in '78 and his cousin in '92, and he told me that land used to be a town, a settlement called Ash Vale that vanished during the floods of 1913, and that there were rumors of a preacher who'd made a deal to protect his people by sacrificing outsiders, and that the church sank with its congregation still inside, bell tolling even as the roof went under. And I tried to tell the authorities. I tried to bring people back, but the lake wasn't on any maps anymore. The trail markers were gone, and even the GPS just spun endlessly like a compass caught in a magnet field. And now, even though I'm home, even though I'm surrounded by noise and life and light, I still hear the voices every night at 3:07 a.m., the same time Thomas vanished. And when I look in the mirror, sometimes I don't see myself. I see the lake behind me, still and wide and full of eyes. And sometimes, just sometimes, I feel water trickling from my nose, cold and endless. And I know deep down that I didn't escape. Not really. I just bought time, and someday soon, the lake will call again, and this time, I won't be able to run. Because once it knows you, once it touches you, you belong to it. And there's no prayer, no priest, no fire strong enough to burn away its claim. And when that time comes, I'll walk into the water just like the others. And maybe I'll be standing next to Thomas, eyes closed, arms at my side. And maybe I'll finally understand the song the lake has been whispering to me ever since that summer. The lullaby of the drowned. It started on the second night after I moved into my new apartment, a third-floor unit in an old brick building on the edge of the city, where the rent was suspiciously low, and the hallways smelled faintly of mildew no matter how many air fresheners I plugged in. And though the place had charm, arched windows, creaky wooden floors, even an antique radiator that made soft ticking sounds when it heated up, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone there. Not in a neighbors playing loud music way, but in a way that made the hair rise on the back of my neck whenever I stood still for too long, like the walls themselves were holding their breath and listening, waiting. And the first real sign that something was off came when I found my bedroom window wide open that morning, even though I knew I'd shut it tight the night before. And it wasn't just open. It was unlatched, pushed all the way up, like someone had climbed in, or climbed out. And I tried to rationalize it, told myself maybe the window didn't lock properly, or maybe I'd just been tired. But when it happened again the next night, and then again the next, I started to grow anxious, not just about the window, but about the strange dreams I'd been having. Vivid, unsettling dreams where I'd wake up paralyzed, lying on my side, unable to move while something in the shadows near the corner of the room watched me, never stepping into the light, but always there, always breathing, always closer than before. And even though I'd wake up drenched in sweat, heart pounding, I never screamed, I never made a sound, because some instinct deep in my gut told me that noise would break the spell, would invite whatever it was to come closer. And the strangest part was that every time I woke from those dreams, the window would be wide open again, and sometimes I swear the air in the room would feel colder, like something had stepped inside and brought the night with it. And I started setting up little traps, not real ones, just things to check if someone had been there. Tape on the windowsill, a glass of water balanced on the ledge, a line of salt I'd read about online. And still, morning after morning, I'd find the window open, the tape peeled, the water spilled, the salt smeared into the floor like someone had deliberately erased it. And what scared me the most was that there was never any sign of a break-in, no footprints, no disturbances on the hallway cameras. And yet every night the dreams grew worse, more detailed, and the figure watching me grew more distinct. A man, tall, thin, dressed in dark, old-fashioned clothing, his face obscured but always smiling, a smile that stretched too wide and never moved, like it had been carved into his skin, and his eyes, oh God, his eyes were the worst part. Not black, not empty, but reflective. Like mirrors, like looking into them showed you yourself, but not you, not really. A twisted, rotting version of you. And when I finally told my landlord, this gruff older woman named Louise who lived on the first floor, she went very still, very quiet, and asked me if it was the sleeping man I was dreaming about. And when I said yes, her face went pale, and she said she'd had complaints before, years ago, from other tenants in that same unit, and that one of them had even moved out in the middle of the night, left all his belongings behind and vanished. And she showed me a photo she kept in her office, an old black and white from the 1940s, and there he was in the background behind a group of smiling factory workers. Him, that same tall figure, same suit, same grin, standing slightly apart but looking directly at the camera. And when I touched the photo, I felt cold all over, like the chill of a grave. And Louise told me that the building used to be a boarding, house during the war, and that one of the original tenants had died in his sleep in that very room, and some say he never left, just stayed there, watching, waiting, needing something, and that it always started with the window, and the dreams, and then the sleep paralysis, and then the real visits. And I laughed. I had to, because the alternative was admitting I was living in a haunted apartment where something came in every night at the same time, just to watch me sleep. And so I started staying up, drinking coffee, doing push-ups, anything to avoid drifting off. But no matter how hard I tried, I'd always fall asleep eventually, and always wake at 3:03 a.m. facing the window, unable to move, and he'd be closer every time. And I swear to you, the last time I woke, he wasn't in the corner anymore. He was right beside the bed, leaning over me, mouth stretched open so wide I could hear the creak of his skin, like wood being split, and his breath was ice. And when I looked into those mirrored eyes, I didn't see myself. I saw him, standing over me, smiling down, watching myself sleep, and I knew somehow that soon the reflection would become reality, and I wouldn't wake up anymore, because he would be in me, or I'd be in him, and either way, the man who watched me sleep would no longer need the window to come in. He'd already found his way inside. I couldn't sleep after that night, not even for a minute, because the memory of those reflective eyes, that grotesque smile, and the way he leaned over me like a shadow ready to consume my body had embedded itself deep into my mind, haunting me in ways that didn't need dreams anymore, and the nights bled into each other. Insomnia became my full-time companion, and I could feel myself slipping, mentally, physically, tethered only by the desperate need to stay awake, because every time I even blinked for too long, I felt him, just at the edge of my consciousness, like he was waiting, like my exhaustion was his invitation. And I tried everything. Energy drinks, pills, blasting music, biting my tongue, digging my nails into my arms, and even standing in a freezing cold shower at 3 a.m. while clutching a kitchen knife, just to stay grounded, just to remind myself that I was still here, still me. But none of it worked forever, because eventually the body gives in, and mine did. Somewhere in that liminal zone between waking and sleep, I found myself in the apartment again, except it wasn't my apartment. Not exactly. Everything looked the same but wrong, like a photograph that had been overexposed. The colors too faded, the shadows too deep, and the air was heavy with this unnatural silence, like the sound had been sucked out of the room, and I could feel him before I saw him. And when I turned around, he was there, sitting in the corner chair, the one I never sat in, the one I instinctively avoided from day one without ever knowing. Why, and he wasn't just watching this time. No, he was smiling, and I could hear it, that wet, stretching noise like skin being peeled from old wood. And when I tried to move, my legs didn't work, and he stood up slowly, like his bones creaked in protest, and he walked toward me with such deliberate slowness, like he was savoring the moment, and with each step, the room seemed to darken. Shadows bleeding in from the corners, consuming everything except him. And as he reached me, he leaned in and whispered, not with words, but with thoughts, invasive and sharp, cutting through my mind like razors, and I understood him, somehow, understood that he was done watching, that now it was my turn, and he touched my chest with one hand, just 2 fingers, and I felt this freezing cold invade my ribs, spreading like ice through my veins, and suddenly I was falling, but not down, inward, like my soul was being pulled from my body and shoved into a box far too small. And when I gasped awake, it wasn't in bed, it was in the chair, in that same cursed chair I never sat in, and I was facing my own body, lying in bed, eyes closed, peacefully asleep, but I couldn't move, couldn't speak, only watch. And then he stepped into view, the man, and he walked over to the bed and got in, slid under the sheets like he'd always belonged there. And he looked at me, my frozen soul trapped in that chair, and he winked, and I felt something break, like the last tether to my body had been severed, and I screamed, or at least I tried to, but no sound came out, because I wasn't in the world anymore, not in the way that mattered. I was displaced, imprisoned in my own home, condemned to watch this thing live my life, sleep in my bed, wear my clothes, use my face, and the worst part is that nobody noticed, not my boss, not my friends. Not the woman I'd been seeing. Everyone thought I seemed better, calmer, more confident, and when I watched him in the mirror, I saw how fluidly he mimicked me, but better, smoother, cleaner, like a version of me without anxiety, without doubt, without the fear that had made me human. And I tried to reach out, tried banging on walls, flipping lights, screaming into the silence, but it was like I was shouting into a vacuum, and even when I managed to cause little things, cold, spots, flickering lights, distant whispers, he would just smile like he wanted me to know he knew I was still watching, and that he didn't care. And days turned into weeks, weeks into months, and I realized I was fading, slowly becoming part of the walls, the floor, the air, and in my desperation, I tried to make contact with someone, anyone, and that's when Louise, the landlord, came up to the apartment one day for a routine inspection, and she paused in the hallway, shivered, and said, "You feel it too, don't you?" And for a brief second our eyes met, mine from inside the mirror, and I saw recognition in her face, like she'd seen this before, like she knew, and she muttered something under her breath in Spanish before backing away and leaving without finishing her inspection, and I clung to that hope, that sliver of acknowledgement. But it wasn't enough, because I was still stuck, still watching this thing live my life. And then one night it all changed again. The man, the one in my body, sat in the chair across from me, looked me in the eyes and said, "Your time is almost up." And then he stood, walked to the window, opened it, and whispered into the night, and within minutes, another man entered, climbing through the window like he belonged there. Tall, thin, same strange smile, same cold aura, and I realized with bone-deep horror that this wasn't just a haunting, it was a procession, a cycle, and that every so often the occupant of the room changed, one soul replaced by another, one puppet cast aside for the next, and that I was never the first, wouldn't be the last, and that these watchers, these silent parasitic things, lived by stealing our lives, wearing our bodies like clothes. And when the new man lay down in the bed, and the one wearing my skin walked over to me and said, "Thank you for your time," everything went dark, and I was gone. But not dead, just dissolved, scattered, reduced to a whisper in the wallpaper, a chill in the air, a dream in someone else's sleep. And sometimes when the new tenant wakes up and finds the window open, they think it was the wind or a forgotten latch. But then the dreams begin, and I'll be there too, just like the ones before me, watching, waiting, screaming in silence as another man comes through the window at 3:03 a.m. I took the night shift at Station 57 because I needed the money, and because, like an idiot, I thought it'd be easy. Just 10 hours in a quiet, half-abandoned rural firehouse on the edge of a small town that barely had anything worth burning. A few weekly calls for brush fires or old people locking themselves out, and every now and then a bored teen setting off fireworks in the woods. But the reality was that something about that place felt wrong the second I walked in, like the walls were too close, like the air never moved, even though the bay doors were always cracked open, and there were no less than 5 windows in the main room. And from my very first shift I noticed things that didn't sit right. Coffee mugs moving an inch or two when I wasn't looking. The ancient scanner radio hissing to life with garbled voices that didn't match any dispatcher's tone. Shadows stretching too far under flickering overhead lights, and this persistent cold that clung to the back hallway like it was hiding something. But I shrugged it off at first, told myself the station was just old, creaky, and maybe a little haunted in the harmless cliché way people like to joke about over cheap beer and truck engines. But the more time I spent there, the more I realized it wasn't a joke. Not even close, because I started hearing footsteps when no one else was scheduled, started seeing faces in the second-floor windows when I knew the upstairs had been sealed. Off since the 90s, and the station's dog, a retired Dalmatian named Axel, would whimper and growl at the fireman's locker in the far back, the one that no longer had a nameplate and that no one ever touched, and I made the mistake of asking about it once, during a slow Tuesday evening when Captain Owens came by to check the logs, and he looked at me, pale and still, and said, "Don't mess with 104's locker," then walked out without another word. And after that I made it a point not to mention it again, but my curiosity kept gnawing at me. especially after I found a dusty photo tucked behind the main logbook, black and white, yellowed with age, showing 6 men in gear lined up outside the station, and one of them, tall, gaunt, with a face too long and eyes that didn't seem to reflect light, had no name written underneath, just a black X, and when I asked one of the senior volunteers about it, he just muttered, "That was before my time," and left early, looking over his shoulder as he backed out of the station, and I started keeping a journal after that, tracking the weird events like a bad detective with too many late-night hours to fill. Strange whispers near the gear rack, the siren lights, flashing without power, voices calling my name from the attic, and one night I found the engine bay soaked in water, like the truck had just returned from a call. Except it hadn't moved. The keys were still in my pocket and the call log was blank, and Axel refused to enter the bay for hours, just sat and whimpered and stared at the empty truck like something was still inside it. And on the 3rd week, I finally broke down and opened locker 104, because I needed to understand why the place felt like it was swallowing me whole. And inside I found a full uniform, old style, faded and stiff with mildew, and a helmet cracked down the center, scorched black, and the name inside was scratched out with something jagged, deep enough to flake the plastic. And underneath the gear was a single Polaroid, warped and water-damaged, showing that same unnamed firefighter standing in the woods behind the station, smiling too wide, holding what looked like a burned corpse, or maybe a dummy. I couldn't tell, but the eyes in the picture seemed real, even though they were melted, and the date was scrawled on the back, March 15th, 1978, the night of the Riverton Woods blaze that supposedly killed a search and rescue crew who were never found. And that night, everything changed, because the fire alarm went off at exactly 2:47 a.m., piercing and loud, even though no call had come in and the system had been manually deactivated earlier for maintenance. And when I checked the control panel, the indicator read unit deployed, which made no sense because again I had the keys. But when I walked into the engine bay, the truck was gone, empty space, wet tire marks, steam in the air like it had just peeled out of there. And when I looked outside, there was nothing, no engine, no sound, just that deep rural darkness that swallows headlights and hope in equal measure. And I called it in, tried to report it, but dispatch just responded with static and a high-pitched whine that made my teeth ache. And then the scanner kicked on with a voice, low, raspy, broken, saying, 104, on scene, over and over. And I froze because the voice sounded like it was inside the room, like it was using the speaker as a mouth, and Axel started barking like mad, bolting from room to room, and the light started to flicker, and in the reflection of the glass doors, I saw it. Him standing behind me, helmet on, gear smoking, one arm held like it was broken, and even though I didn't turn around, I knew if I did, I wouldn't live to regret it. So I ran, full sprint, out of the station into the night, tripping into the ditch by the tree line, and when I looked back, the station was dark again, like nothing had happened, like it had swallowed its own nightmare, and was waiting for me to come back, and I stayed outside until sunrise, clutching Axel, watching that building with every breath held tight. And I called in sick the next day, but when I returned that evening to grab my gear and quit for good, the engine was back, keys in the ignition, floor dry, and no one said a word about it, just nodded like everything was fine, like it had always been fine. And I knew then that Station 57 wasn't a place. It was a trap, a lure, a ritual. And that 104 wasn't a ghost in the way people think about ghosts, but something older, something that needed to be remembered to survive. And I had given it attention, fed it with fear. And now it knew me, like it had known all the others before me. And the worst part, the part that keeps me awake every night, is that even though I left, even though I moved 2 states away and never wore that badge again, I still hear the alarm some nights, faint and distant, echoing through my dreams at 2:47 a.m. And sometimes, when I wake up, my boots are wet, and I can smell smoke and there's muddy tire tracks across my living room floor. Like the truck had come to bring me back, because once you open 104's locker, you never really clock out again. After that night, I tried to convince myself that it was a vivid hallucination brought on by too much caffeine and not enough sleep, a mixture of stress and paranoia that had turned an old, dusty fire station into a haunted house in my mind. But that lie didn't last long, especially when I started seeing Engine 57 in places it couldn't possibly be, parked across the street from my motel in a different state, rolling slowly behind me in my rearview mirror on empty back roads, lights off, engine silent, or sitting. In the distance on the side of the highway, partially hidden in the fog, its scorched and twisted number plate unmistakable, like it was watching, always waiting, always inching closer. And the more I ignored it, the more obvious it became, until one night I walked out to my car and found ash scattered across the hood, thick and dark and reeking of old smoke, and there were boot prints, leading from the road to my front door, heavy firefighter boots, soaked and blackened like they'd been pulled from a river of tar. And I knew then that whatever I'd released by opening Locker 104 hadn't stayed behind. It had attached itself to me, threaded into my life like smoke into fabric, and I had no idea how to escape it, no idea what it wanted, only that it seemed drawn to routine, to ritual, to the old habits of the station, the logbook, the alarm, the midnight coffee breaks, the ancient routines of checking equipment and walking perimeter, and it began demanding those things from me, recreating them in my daily life whether I wanted to or not. Lights in my apartment flickering on at 2:47 a.m., my phone vibrating with fake dispatch alerts, the faint hiss of the radio whispering call signs in the dead of night. And I started keeping the fire journal again, logging each occurrence like I had before, even though every instinct told me to burn it all and run, because a part of me believed that as long as I kept the routine, I could manage it, keep it contained, feed it just enough attention to prevent something worse, something final. And I began living in a state of constant dread, moving every few weeks, changing phones, jobs, even my name at one point. But no matter how far I went, I'd find signs. An old Station 57 patch stuck under my windshield wiper, a photograph slipped into my mailbox of the scorched forest, with a smudged figure watching from behind the trees, or that unmistakable smell of smoke and damp mildew that clung to my clothes even after repeated washes. And then came the dreams, the ones where I'd be back at the station, alone, but somehow not alone, walking its halls while something just out of frame followed, breathing heavy, dragging a cracked helmet along the walls, whispering call signs that didn't match anything in modern systems, codes like 749B or Delta 6 Obsidian, and every dream ended the same way, with me opening Locker 104, pulling out that helmet and putting it on, only to feel something crawl inside my head, something vast and old and burning, and when I'd wake up my pillow would be soaked with sweat, my ears ringing like the station bell had been clanging for hours, and my dog, Axel, who I'd brought with me when I fled, would be hiding under the bed, growling low, his body trembling, eyes locked on the closet like something was standing there, waiting to be let out. And one night, after another dream that ended with me walking into the forest behind the station, I woke to find ash-covered footprints across my hardwood floor, leading to the back door, and when I checked the lock, it was unlatched, though I never left it open, and Axel was gone, his leash still on the hook, no signs of struggle. Just that eerie silence that follows after something violent and final. And I screamed his name for hours, drove around town, knocking on doors, putting up posters, calling every shelter and vet for miles, but no one had seen him. And deep down, I knew. Station 57 had taken him, and not out of malice, but as payment. A reminder that I owed it something, that I had stirred something sacred and old and needed to answer for it. And I didn't know what else to do. So I went back, against every ounce of survival in my body. I drove 14 hours straight to that cursed station, arriving just after midnight. The building exactly as I remembered it, dark, decaying, humming with that strange static energy. And I walked in, clutching Axel's collar in my hand, my boots, leaving prints in the dust, and as I crossed into the engine bay, the lights flickered on one by one. The scanner crackled to life, and the bay doors creaked open slowly, like jaws welcoming me home. And the logbook sat on the desk, clean, open, pen ready, and I signed in, 104, present, reporting for duty. And the moment I did, I felt something shift in the air, like a breath exhaled from the walls. A deep, aching satisfaction. And the siren above the building let out a long, low wail, one I hadn't heard in years, and the truck, engine 57, appeared from the fog, sliding into the bay without making a sound, its lights flickering weakly, and its driver's door creaked. Open slowly, inviting me in, and I knew what it meant, knew that I could ride it out, make the full loop, complete the circuit, and maybe, just maybe, end this once and for all. Or at least learn the rules of whatever game I'd stumbled into. And I stepped inside, the seat cold and soaked, the radio crackling with static, and, as the door slammed shut, I heard a voice whisper over the system. "Unit 104 en route, Riverton fire perimeter breach," and the engine roared to life, the walls of the station blurring around me. And for a moment I swear I saw Axel, sitting in the co-driver's seat, panting gently, eyes glowing faintly, as if pulled into the same cycle, and the truck barreled forward into a forest road that didn't exist on any map, flames licking the highs, edges, trees blackened and howling with wind. And I understood then that Station 57 wasn't bound by place or time, that it was a node in something older, a thin place between here and whatever comes next. And every few years, someone new opened. Locker 104. Took up the call sign, answered the bell, and fed the fire. And I had become the next in line. Not chosen, but accepted. Because I'd looked too long, asked too many questions, walked through a door meant to remain sealed, and now I was part of the route, part of the rotation, the cursed relay of forgotten firehouses and wandering trucks and engines that burned not just trees but memories. And the worst part, the part that twists my stomach with every new shift, is that the fire we respond to isn't always in the forest, isn't always out there. Sometimes it's in people's homes, in minds, in dreams, and sometimes we arrive too late, and sometimes we start the fire ourselves and the call signs have stopped making sense, replaced by dates and names and places that shouldn't exist, and every time we drive, I lose a little more of myself until I'm just a driver with no face, no past, no future, and someday someone will find my picture in the back of a dusty logbook, no name, just a black X, and the cycle will begin again, because Station 57 doesn't forget, and it never lets go, not really, not ever. Story 5. The stranger in my childhood home. It began on a night much like any other, or so I thought, but as I sit here now recounting it, I realize how deeply wrong that assumption was. My childhood home had always been a place of comfort, a sanctuary from the harsh world outside. It was a small house, tucked away in a quiet suburban neighborhood, surrounded by tall trees and thick, overgrown hedges that kept it hidden from view, as if nature itself wanted to shield the house from prying eyes. The kind of house that had seen generations pass, where each creak of the floorboards told a story, and each window seemed to hold the ghosts of memories long past. But that night, on the eve of my return after years of being away, it became something else entirely, something darker, something that would change my understanding of reality itself. I hadn't been back in years. Life had taken me away, sending me to cities far and wide, chasing jobs, relationships, and experiences. But when my mother passed away suddenly, I found myself returning to the house I had grown up in, not out of any particular attachment to the place, but because I was now the only one left to handle her estate. The house was old, falling apart in places, but I always thought there was something magical about it, something comforting about the creaking of the wooden floors and the way the light filtered through the thick curtains, casting long shadows across the walls. But when I stepped into that house again, I felt a strange unease settle in my stomach. It was as if the house itself knew that I was no longer the child I once was, and that something was wrong. I went about the tasks of sorting, through my mother's belongings, packing things up, making arrangements. The house felt empty but not quite silent. The wind whistled through the cracks in the old wooden frame, and there was a soft thumping sound from upstairs, as if someone was moving around. I convinced myself it was just the house settling, old pipes, or perhaps the breeze, rattling the shutters. But then came the sounds in the night, the tapping against the walls, faint at first, like someone gently knocking. I couldn't explain it, but it was enough to make me pause, to freeze in place, heart hammering against my chest. I knew I was alone in the house. I had checked every room, locked every door, made sure the windows were all secured. Yet at night the sounds persisted. At first a faint scratching, then a soft knock, followed by a low guttural murmur that seemed to echo from somewhere deep within the walls. The first few nights I chalked it up to my nerves. After all, I hadn't been here in so long, and the house had always been creaky. Maybe the sound of a shifting floorboard or an old pipe was just playing tricks on my mind. But when I woke up one night to the unmistakable sound of footsteps above me, heavy and deliberate, I knew something was off. I lay frozen in my bed, trying to convince myself it was the house settling, but the sound was too distinct, too real, to be ignored. And when I turned to look toward the stairs, I saw it, just a flicker of movement in the dim light, a shadow stretching from the top of the staircase and moving down like a person, though it didn't feel like a person. It wasn't human in the way that I understood it to be. There was something wrong with it, something twisted in its very presence. I grabbed my phone and texted the local police, but no response came. I could hear my heart pounding in my chest, my hands shaking as I reached for the flashlight beside my bed, my only source of comfort in the dark. The footsteps grew louder, closer, as if whatever was up there was slowly making its way down the stairs toward me. I didn't know what to do. I wanted to leave, to run, but the house had a hold on me. A strange magnetism that kept my feet planted, kept me rooted to the spot. The light flickered as I held it in front of me, casting long, eerie shadows across the room. I could hear my breath coming in shallow gasps, could feel the cold sweat running down my spine. I told myself it was nothing. I told myself it had to be nothing. But as the sound reached the bottom of the stairs, I knew it wasn't. Then I heard the voice. It wasn't loud, but it was clear, a whisper so soft it could have been mistaken for the wind if I hadn't been straining to listen. It came from just outside my door, muffled but unmistakable, and I could make out only a few words. "Let me in. Let me in." My heart nearly stopped. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. There was no way anyone else was in this house. No one else had keys. No one else could be here. My mind raced, trying to process what was happening, but my body was frozen. My hand gripped so tightly around the flashlight that my knuckles turned white. The voice came again, clearer this time, closer. "Let me in." I moved to the door, slowly, cautiously, praying that I was just imagining it. But when I looked through the peephole, I saw nothing. No one. Only darkness. I opened the door, heart in my throat, flashlight trembling in my hand, but there was no one there. The hallway was empty. The house was silent. But I could feel something. A presence. Something watching me from just beyond the walls. The air grew thick, oppressive, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been waiting for me. Something had been in this house long before I ever came back, and it was still here, waiting, watching, biding its time. And that was when I realized whatever was in this house wasn't a mere presence. It wasn't a ghost or some lingering memory of the past. It was something else, something alive in a way that shouldn't be possible, something that had attached itself to this place, to this house, and that it was inviting me to stay. I couldn't explain it, but deep down I knew. I knew that this thing was connected to the house, to my family, to the very foundation of the place I once called home, and I also knew that it wasn't going to let me leave without a price. The nights that followed were no easier to bear. Each time I tried to sleep, the sounds returned. Soft scratching noises, whispers that seemed to come from behind the walls, footsteps creeping across the upstairs floor. At first, I tried to tell myself it was my mind playing tricks on me, that the grief and stress of losing my mother had begun to take its toll. But the more time I spent in that house, the more I realized how wrong I was. The atmosphere had changed. The air felt thick, suffocating, as though it were pressing down on me, urging me to leave. I could no longer deny the reality of it all. There was something in that house, something ancient, something that I couldn't understand, but that understood me all too well. One night, unable to sleep, I decided to leave my room and investigate the source of the sounds. I moved through the house quietly, Flashlight in hand, my heart hammering in my chest. Each room I passed seemed to whisper secrets, the shadows stretching longer as I ventured deeper into the heart of the house. I reached the stairs, my feet hesitating as I looked up into the darkness of the second floor. The last time I'd been up there was years ago, when I was a child. The rooms had been unused for so long, save for the occasional dusting, but tonight they felt different. They felt alive. I slowly ascended the stairs, trying to keep my footsteps as quiet as possible, though my breath came in shallow gasps. When I reached the top, I stood still, listening. The house was quiet now. Too quiet. The kind of silence that presses in on your ears and makes every little sound seem deafening. The darkness felt almost palpable, and I could feel the weight of it pushing against me, as though it were a living, breathing entity. I stood at the top of the stairs for what felt like an eternity, unsure of where to go or what to do next. But then I heard it again, the faint sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, echoing from down the hall. I took a deep breath and crept forward, the flashlight trembling in my hand. The footsteps grew louder, more distinct, as though whatever was making them was drawing closer. I could feel my pulse pounding in my ears as I reached the end of the hallway and pushed open the door to the room where the sound was coming from. The moment I stepped inside, the temperature dropped. It was sudden, like a gust of icy wind had swept through the room, though there was no draft. I scanned the room, but it was empty. There was nothing there. Just the remnants of old furniture, covered in dust, old curtains hanging limp by the window, and the faint scent of something long forgotten. But something wasn't right. Something had changed. I moved further into the room, shining my flashlight around the corners, searching for any sign of movement. That's when I noticed it, the mirror. Her large ornate mirror stood against the far wall, its surface covered in a fine layer of dust. But something about it felt wrong. The edges seemed darker than the rest of the room, and as I gazed into it, I could swear the reflection didn't match the room around me. The air seemed to shift as if something was watching me through that mirror, something that was not part of this world. I turned away from the mirror, my heart racing as I backed toward the door, but that's when I heard the voice again, louder, this time. It wasn't a whisper anymore, it was a command. "Come closer," it said, the words thick with malice. I spun around, my flashlight shaking wildly as I searched the room, but there was nothing. No one. Yet the voice remained low and insistent, as though it was coming from all around me, from within the very walls of the house itself. I wanted to run, to get out, but my body refused to move. I stood frozen, caught in the grip of whatever was in that room with me. The shadows in the corner seemed to shift, growing darker, more pronounced. A shape began to form from within the darkness, a figure tall and thin, its features obscured by the gloom. But even as I watched, I could feel its gaze upon me, its presence wrapping itself around me like a vice. The air grew colder, and my breath came out in visible puffs. I tried to scream, to run, but no sound escaped my throat. My body was no longer my own. I was trapped, unable to move, unable to escape. The figure stepped closer, and I could see it now, though its features remained shrouded in darkness. It had long, slender limbs, and a face that seemed to shift, as though it were not truly a face at all. There were no eyes, no mouth, just a smooth, pale surface where a face should have been. I could feel its cold presence pressing in on me, feel the weight of its malice suffocating me. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, it vanished. I collapsed to the floor, gasping for air, my mind reeling from what I had just witnessed. I had to get out. I had to leave. But as I made my way toward the door, I realized something terrible. The door wouldn't open. The handle wouldn't turn. I was trapped. Panic surged through me as I pounded on the door, screaming for help that never came. The house was alive with sound now, scratching, knocking, whispering. It was as if the walls themselves were closing in. The house itself was alive, feeding off my fear, trapping me in its embrace. And then I heard it, that voice again. "Let me in." But this time it wasn't outside the door. It was in my mind. It was inside me. The next few hours were a blur. I have no memory of how I managed to escape, only that I woke up outside, lying on the cold ground, the moon high above me. My body ached, my mind was fractured, and I felt as though I had just returned from some place far darker than any of us could ever imagine. I never went back into that house. I left the keys behind and never looked back. But even now, years later, I can still hear that voice, feel that presence lurking in the shadows of my memories. It has followed me, even now, reminding me that some houses are better left untouched, and some doors should never be opened. Story 6. The Haunted Hospital Wing. It was supposed to be a regular night shift, just like any other. I had been working in the emergency room of St. Thomas Memorial for over 3 years, and I thought I had seen it all. From the most critical traumas to the mundane drunk stumbling in with a sprained ankle, nothing really fazed me anymore. But that all changed the night I was assigned to the old wing of the hospital, a section that had long been abandoned, or so I thought. The building itself was old, too old. Really. St. Thomas Memorial had been around since the early 1900s, and parts of it were beginning to show their age. The emergency room had been modernized and was in good condition, but there were still areas of the hospital that had been neglected. The old wing, once used for psychiatric patients, was one of those places. It had been shut down for nearly a decade, its hallways filled with dust and forgotten memories. But on this particular night, the wing had been opened again, and I was the one to be sent there. At first I thought it was just a routine cleaning job. They needed to move some old medical equipment, and I was asked to help. The rest of the staff, including my fellow nurses, were busy with their own tasks, so I was sent alone to retrieve the items. The moment I stepped into that wing, a chill ran down my spine. It wasn't the cold air, although the temperature was noticeably lower than in the rest of the hospital. No, it was the feeling of being watched, of something lurking just beyond my field of vision. The hallways seemed to stretch endlessly, the flickering overhead lights casting long, uneven shadows on the cracked walls. I made my way down the narrow corridor, my footsteps echoing far louder than they should have. The building seemed so quiet, almost too quiet, as if the whole place was holding its breath. I couldn't help but glance around nervously, half expecting someone, or something, to jump out at me. But there was nothing, just empty rooms, abandoned, beds and the lingering scent of old antiseptic. As I reached the end of the hallway, I found the storage room, but something stopped me from opening the door. There was a faint sound coming from inside, something that sounded almost like a muffled cry. I hesitated for a moment, unsure if I was hearing things, but then it came again, a soft, pleading sound. My heart skipped a beat. I had been working here long enough to know that St. Thomas was one of the busiest hospitals in the region, and there was no way anyone was supposed to be in this part of the building. I pushed the door open cautiously, the hinges creaking as I stepped inside. The room was dark, the only light coming from the dim hallway outside. At first I didn't see anything unusual. There were just old medical carts, boxes of supplies, and a few pieces of broken furniture. But then I saw her, a woman sitting on the floor in the far corner, her back to me. She was wearing a hospital gown, the fabric stained with something dark. Her hair was matted to her face, and she was rocking back and forth, whispering to herself in a language I didn't understand. I froze. I knew I should have backed out and alerted security, but something about the situation kept me rooted to the spot. I don't know why, but I took a step forward, my hand reaching out to tap her on the shoulder. That was when she turned around, and the world seemed to freeze. Her face was twisted in agony, her eyes wide and unblinking. But what really made my blood run cold was the smile that curled up on her lips. It wasn't a human smile. It was something far worse. It was a grin that seemed to stretch too wide, the skin on her face pulling back, revealing jagged teeth that looked far too sharp for a human mouth. I could feel my pulse racing as she slowly rose to her feet, her head tilting to one side as if she were studying me. And then she spoke in a voice that sent chills down my spine. "You're not supposed to be here," she said, her voice hoarse as though she hadn't spoken in years. "They're coming for you." The door behind me slammed shut with a force that nearly knocked me off my feet. My heart was pounding in my chest as I spun around to find that the room was now completely sealed off. The woman, if she could even be called that, was slowly advancing toward me, her movements unnatural, jerky, as if her limbs were stiff from disuse. Her grin widened, her teeth gleaming in the dim light. Before I could even think of what to do, I heard a voice clear and sharp coming from somewhere down the hallway. It was a man's voice, but I couldn't make out the words. I turned, desperate for help, but when I looked back, the hallway was empty. The woman was gone, as if she had never been there. The room was silent once again, save for the sound of my ragged breathing. I didn't know what to do. My mind was reeling, and I had no idea if I had imagined the whole thing or if it had been real. But the feeling of dread gnawed at me, and I knew deep down that something terrible had just happened. I rushed out of the room, the door swinging open with ease this time. My legs were shaky, and I couldn't get out of that wing fast enough. The whole place felt wrong, as though the very walls were closing in on me. The moment I stepped back, into the main hospital, I heard the faintest of whispers, like someone breathing down my neck. I turned around, but no one was there. I went back to my station that night, trying to shake off the feeling of unease. But it didn't work. I couldn't stop thinking about the woman, her face, her voice, and most of all, the words she had spoken to me. "They're coming for you." The rest of my shift passed in a blur, but every time I closed my eyes, I could see her, watching me from the dark corners of the hospital. I didn't know what I had stumbled upon, but I knew one thing for sure. I was no longer alone in St. Thomas Memorial. The following days were a blur of exhaustion and anxiety. I couldn't shake the image of the woman in the abandoned wing, her hollow eyes and twisted smile haunting me every moment I was awake. The rest of the staff didn't seem to notice anything unusual, but I couldn't stop myself from being paranoid. I avoided the old wing at all costs, even though the hospital was still using it sporadically for storage. Every time I walked by the entrance, I could feel a chill creep over me, like something was watching from within. And sometimes, if I listened closely enough, I could almost hear the faintest whispers coming from behind those closed doors. It wasn't long before I started hearing more stories from other staff members. Whispers, rumors, half-hearted jokes about the old wing being haunted. At first I tried to ignore them, chalking them up to superstitions, but the more I heard, the more my unease grew. There were stories of patients who had wandered into that wing in a delirious state, only to come back with strange stories of people they'd met inside, people who didn't exist. Some of them even claimed to have seen the same woman I had encountered, rocking in a corner, mumbling incoherently, her face twisted in that horrible smile. One night, during my break, I overheard two of the night shift nurses talking about the wing. They spoke in hushed tones as if they were afraid of being overheard. "You heard about the incident last week, right?" one of them asked, her voice trembling slightly. "The janitor who went in there to clean? He hasn't been seen since." The other nurse shook her head. "I heard he just disappeared. No one knows what happened to him, but I've heard rumors. Some say the wing is cursed, that something in there takes people. I don't know if I believe it, but something's definitely wrong in that part of the hospital." The conversation left me shaken. I couldn't stop thinking about what they'd said. The janitor, the last person to enter that wing, hadn't been seen again. What if that woman wasn't the only thing hiding in that place? What if there were other darker forces at play? The thought of going back in there made my stomach churn, but the curiosity gnawed at me. What was it about that wing? Why did it feel so wrong? I knew I had to find out. That night, after my shift ended, I decided to go back to the old wing. I couldn't stop thinking about it, couldn't shake the feeling that something was calling me. I didn't know what I was looking for. Answers, closure, or maybe just a way to make sense of the terror I had felt. I wasn't sure, but something inside me urged me to return. I waited until the hospital had quieted down. Most of the staff had gone home and only a few patients remained. I slipped away from my duties and made my way toward the old wing. The hospital was eerily quiet, and my footsteps echoed in the halls as I walked toward the restricted area. The lights flickered, casting long, unsettling shadows on the walls. I could hear the faint hum of the air conditioning, but it only made the silence more oppressive. When I reached the door to the abandoned wing, I hesitated. The air felt heavier here, like the weight of something dark was pressing down on me. but I pushed through my fear and opened the door. It creaked loudly and I winced at the sound. The room inside was even darker than remembered. The dim hallway light didn't reach in here, and I was forced to use my phone's flashlight to see. I stepped inside, my heart pounding in my chest. The hallway stretched out before me, just as I remembered, narrow and suffocating. The smell of dust and decay was stronger now, and it made my stomach turn. I walked down the corridor, my eyes scanning the rooms as I passed. Everything was abandoned, old beds, dusty medical equipment, and broken furniture scattered throughout. It was as if the wing had been frozen in time, left to decay and rot in silence. But as I walked deeper into the hallway, something caught my attention. A faint sound, a soft rustling, like someone moving just out of sight. I stopped in my tracks, straining to hear. The sound came again, closer this time. It was unmistakable. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, approaching from behind. My heart skipped a beat. I spun around, but there was no one there. The hallway was empty. The silence returned, and I couldn't help but feel a creeping sense of dread wash over me. I wasn't alone in this wing, and I knew it. I turned back around and continued walking, my footsteps quickening. I couldn't shake the feeling that something or someone was following me. My phone's flashlight flickered briefly, casting eerie shadows on the walls, but I didn't dare stop to fix it. I had to get out of there. That was when I heard it again, the soft rustling, this time followed by a faint whisper. "Get out," the voice said, barely audible. It sounded like a woman's voice, but distorted, as if coming from far away. I froze in place, my breath catching in my throat. I looked around, panic rising in my chest, but there was no one. The hallway was still, empty, the rooms still abandoned, but I couldn't ignore the feeling, the unmistakable sensation that I was being watched. I had to leave. Now. I turned and began to run down the hall, my breath coming in ragged gasps as I desperately tried to make my way back to the door. My footsteps echoed loudly, and every turn seemed to take longer than the last. I could hear, the whispers now, clearer than before, growing louder and more insistent. They were coming from the rooms, from the corners of the hallway, from the walls themselves. "Get out," they repeated, over and over. I reached the door, but just as I was about to pull it open, I felt a hand on my shoulder. I spun around, but there was no one there. My heart was pounding in my chest as I yanked the door open and ran into the main part of the hospital. I didn't stop until I reached the staff lounge, my legs weak, my body trembling. I couldn't explain what had happened, but I knew one thing for sure. Whatever haunted that wing, it was not done with me. It was the kind of day that made you want to stay indoors, wrapped in a blanket, sipping hot coffee, and reading a good book. But my job as a ranger required me to be out in the woods no matter the weather. I had been assigned to patrol a particularly remote area of the forest that morning, an area few dared to enter, but it was part of my responsibility to ensure that no one strayed too far off the marked trails. The forest was thick with ancient pines, their towering trunks blocking out most of the sunlight, casting long, eerie shadows on the forest floor. The air was cool, damp with dew, and the forest was oddly silent, as if the usual rustle of wildlife had been replaced with an unnatural stillness. As I made my way down the trail, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. It was probably just my mind playing tricks on me, but it felt as though the trees themselves were closing in around me, like they were hiding something. I shook off the unease and pressed on. After all, I had been a ranger for years and had traversed these woods countless times without incident. However, as the hours passed and I ventured further from the main trails, I began to notice something strange. A figure appeared not far in the distance, seemingly walking parallel to my path. It wasn't uncommon to see hikers in these woods, but something about this person caught my attention. They were moving too quickly, too effortlessly almost, as if they were gliding over the rough terrain. I watched for a moment, trying to make sense of it, but the figure soon disappeared behind a thicket of trees. Odd, I thought, but I didn't pay it much mind at the time. Maybe they had taken a shortcut or were heading back to the main trail. It wasn't unusual to see people try to stray off the path in search of adventure or solitude. I continued on, but something kept nagging at me. an unsettling feeling that something wasn't right. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I found myself glancing over my shoulder every few minutes, half expecting to see the figure reappear. It wasn't until much later in the afternoon that I realized I had wandered far off the usual trail. I had been so caught up in the strange encounter with the figure that I hadn't paid attention to my surroundings. The forest had grown denser, the trees towering even higher, and the silence had deepened, growing more oppressive. A thick fog began to roll in, swallowing the landscape in a ghostly white veil, and with it came a sense of disorientation. I reached for my map, trying to pinpoint where I was, but as I examined it, a sinking feeling washed over me. The terrain on the map didn't match what I was seeing. The familiar landmarks were nowhere to be found, replaced by unfamiliar terrain that didn't exist in the park. That was when I realized something was wrong. I wasn't on the usual path anymore. Somehow I had stumbled into a part of the forest that wasn't supposed to be there. Panic set in as I realized I had no idea where I was, no idea how I had gotten this far off track. I turned around, hoping to retrace my steps, but the fog had thickened, obscuring any familiar landmarks. I tried to calm myself, reminding myself that I had navigated this forest 1,000 times before, but the deeper I ventured, the more disoriented I became. The trees, now ghostly shadows in the mist, seemed to twist and bend in unnatural ways, and every step I took seemed to lead me deeper into the unknown. I pulled out my radio and tried to make contact with the ranger station, but there was no signal. My heart began to race as I realized that I was completely alone. Then, out of nowhere, I heard a noise, a faint rustling sound, barely perceptible at first, but growing louder with each passing second. My pulse quickened and I spun around, but there was no one there. The forest was silent again, except for the soft murmur of the wind. I tried to push the panic down, convincing myself it was just an animal, maybe a deer or a small creature, but deep down, I knew that wasn't the case. I felt the presence of something watching me from the shadows, something far more sinister than any wild animal. As the minutes ticked by, the sounds grew more distinct, footsteps, slow and deliberate, echoing from all sides. I could hear them getting closer. I spun around again, my eyes scanning the foggy surroundings, but still I saw nothing. My breath caught in my throat. The footsteps stopped. For a long moment, there was complete silence, and then, in a voice that sent chills down my spine, I heard a whisper from the fog as if it was right beside me. "How you shouldn't be here." I froze, my blood running cold. The voice was low, almost a growl, and yet there was something oddly familiar about it. It was the same voice I had heard earlier, the voice I had mistaken for a figment of my imagination. But this time it wasn't in my head, it was real. The sound of footsteps resumed, closer now, and then before I could react, something reached out from the mist and grabbed my arm. I gasped, my heart racing as I spun around, expecting to see a person, but there was no one there. The grip on my arm was gone, and I was alone once again in the suffocating fog. The voice spoke again, this time louder, more urgent. "Get out of the woods!" Panic surged through me as I turned and ran, desperate to escape whatever was lurking in the shadows. I had no idea what was following me, but the thought of staying there any longer was unbearable. My mind raced, my breath coming in short gasps as I ran through the fog, weaving between the trees, my feet stumbling over roots and rocks. The deeper I went, the more distorted the forest seemed to become. The trees twisted in grotesque shapes, their branches reaching out like skeletal hands. I could still hear the footsteps, the voice growing closer with each passing second. And then, just as I thought I couldn't run any longer, I stumbled into an open clearing. The fog began to dissipate, and I saw a figure standing in the distance, barely visible through the mist. It was a person, or at least I thought it was at first. As I took a step forward, the figure turned to face me. What I saw nearly made my heart stop. It wasn't human. Its face was twisted and contorted, its eyes black pits of emptiness, and its mouth was stretched into a grotesque smile. I couldn't move, couldn't scream, couldn't do anything but stare in terror. The figure raised its hand slowly, and I felt an overwhelming urge to run, but my legs wouldn't respond. I was frozen in place, trapped in the grip of fear. And then, as if it were waiting for me to make the first move. It stepped forward. I didn't have time to think. I turned and fled, sprinting through the clearing, my heart pounding in my chest. The sounds of the footsteps grew louder, faster, but I didn't dare look back. I had to get out of there, had to escape the thing that had been following me. My mind was a blur of panic and adrenaline as I pushed myself harder, faster. But it was no use. The forest seemed endless, and the creature seemed to be right behind me, no matter how fast I ran. The fog had returned, thick and suffocating, and I could barely see a foot in front of me. But I didn't stop, not until the forest began to thin and I saw the faint glow of the ranger station in the distance. I stumbled into the clearing, gasping for air, my legs trembling beneath me. I collapsed onto the ground, my body shaking uncontrollably, and for the first time in hours I dared to look back. There was nothing behind me, no footsteps, no shadowy figures, just the empty, silent forest. I didn't know what had happened, what I had encountered, but I never went back into those woods again. Some things in that forest aren't meant to be understood. And I knew I had narrowly escaped whatever dark forces lurked in those trees. I spent the next few days recovering from the experience, both physically and mentally, but no matter how much I tried to convince myself that I had simply been scared, that it was just a trick of the fog, I couldn't shake the unsettling feeling that I had encountered something unnatural. The image of the creature's twisted face haunted me in my dreams, its dark, empty eyes following me wherever I went. I couldn't stop thinking about the way the forest had seemed to warp and shift, as if it had a mind of its own, guiding me deeper into its heart. I told myself that I had just been caught in a moment of fear, that it was my imagination running wild in the isolation of the woods. But deep down I knew something was wrong. Something in that forest had been watching me, and it wasn't human. Days passed, but the unease never truly left. I kept thinking about the figure I had seen before, the one that had appeared out of nowhere, walking just out of sight, gliding through the trees. It didn't feel like a regular hiker, it didn't even feel like a human being. There was something unnatural about the way it moved, the way it seemed to fade in and out of sight, as if it were a part of the forest itself. I couldn't shake the feeling that it had been leading me, guiding me deeper into the woods, and that it had known exactly what it was doing. I had to go back. I couldn't leave it like this. If there was a chance I had missed something important, something that could explain what I had experienced, I needed to find it. The forest had a way of keeping its secrets, but I couldn't let it hold on to them any longer. I packed my gear, grabbed my compass, and headed back out into the woods. The air was thick with the weight of a storm that had yet to break, and the clouds hung low, casting a grey pall over everything. As I made my way back to the same trail, I felt a familiar unease settle in my stomach. I couldn't explain it, but it was like the forest itself was watching me, waiting for me to make a mistake. Every step felt wrong. Every crack of a twig underfoot felt like an alarm. But I pressed on, determined to get to the bottom of this. The trail felt different this time, as if the forest was deliberately throwing off my bearings. I had walked this same path hundreds of times, but now everything seemed unfamiliar. The trees were taller, their branches twisted in ways I didn't remember, and the ground was uneven, as if the forest had shifted in the time I had been away. I paused, checking my map and compass. The markings on the map didn't align with what I was seeing in front of me. I had taken the same route as before, but somehow I had ended up somewhere completely different. Panic surged in my chest. How was this possible? The forest hadn't changed, or had it? I didn't have time to think about it. I had to keep moving, had to figure out what was happening. My breath was coming in quick, shallow gasps now, my nerves fraying with each passing moment. I pushed forward, determined not to get lost in my own fear. The fog had returned, thick and impenetrable, and the air grew colder. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end, as if the forest itself was alive, aware of my presence, and disapproving of my intrusion. I continued to walk, my eyes scanning the mist for any sign of the figure I had seen before. I had to know what it was, who it was, and why it had been following me. Hours passed. The fog thickened and the woods grew darker with every step I took. I couldn't even tell if it was morning or evening anymore. Time had lost its meaning. in the suffocating mist. And then, just as I was beginning to lose hope, I saw something ahead. A faint light flickering in the distance. I couldn't tell if it was a lantern or some kind of glow, but I felt drawn to it, like it was calling me. The closer I got, the more I realized it wasn't a light at all. It was a figure, standing in the mist, barely visible but unmistakable. The same figure I had seen before. It was standing still, watching me from the fog, and I knew in that moment that it had been waiting for me. I froze, my body locked in place by a mixture of fear and awe. The figure didn't move, didn't speak. It simply stood there, its presence undeniable, its gaze piercing through the mist as if it had been expecting me all along. For a moment, neither of us moved. It was like we were frozen in time. And then, without warning, the figure stepped forward. I should have run. I should have turned around and fled back to the ranger station, but I couldn't. Something about it was magnetic, pulling me in against my will. I took a step forward, my feet moving of their own accord, and then another. And then suddenly, the figure was gone. Just as quickly as it had appeared, it vanished into the fog. I stood there, stunned, my mind racing to process what had just happened. Where had it gone? Why had it disappeared? I felt a chill run down my spine as the answer hit me. It wasn't real. It was a part of the forest, something that didn't belong in the world of the living, something that had been waiting for me. I turned and ran as fast as I could, the sounds of footsteps echoing behind me, getting closer with every passing moment. I didn't look back. I didn't stop until I reached the clearing where the ranger station stood. I collapsed in front of the station, gasping for air, my body trembling with adrenaline and fear. But the figure, the forest and the cold, oppressive fog were gone. The world around me was silent and the mist had lifted, revealing the trees once again. I didn't know what had happened, but I knew one thing for sure. I would never return to that part of the forest again. The forest had a way of hiding its secrets, but some things were better left undiscovered. Some things should never be explored. Story 8. The night was quiet, almost too quiet, as I sat alone in my room in the old house I had just moved into. My parents had always dreamed of living in the countryside, and when we finally bought the old farmhouse on the edge of town, it felt like a dream come true. The house had a certain charm to it, despite its age, with creaking wooden floors, high ceilings, and large windows that looked out over the vast fields. It was perfect for a fresh start, away from the chaos of the city. But from the moment I stepped inside, something felt off. At first I couldn't quite put my finger on it, but it was the small things that made me uneasy. The strange draft in the hallway that would blow through even when all the windows were closed, the way the light would flicker at odd hours of the night, and the eerie stillness that filled the house once the sun went down. My parents, however, were convinced that it was just old house quirks, nothing to worry about. They were in love with the place, and their excitement kept them blind to the unsettling energy I was beginning to feel. I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something watching me. Every night as the sun set and the house grew darker, I felt an increasing sense of dread. I told myself it was just my imagination, that I was just nervous about the new surroundings. But the feeling never went away. It wasn't until I started hearing the whispers that I realized there was something truly wrong with the house. At first I thought it was the wind, maybe the old walls groaning as the house settled, but then the whispers started to sound like words. Faint, almost imperceptible at first, but gradually becoming clearer. I tried to ignore it, thinking it was just my mind playing tricks on me. But then one night it was different. I was in bed reading a book by the light of a small lamp when I heard it again. This time it was louder, clearer. It sounded like someone was standing just outside my door, whispering my name. My heart skipped a beat and I froze, not sure what to do. The voice was too real, too human to be the wind. It was soft, barely audible, but there was something unmistakably sinister about it. "Sarah, Sarah," the voice called, slow and deliberate, sending a chill down my spine. I didn't move. I didn't speak. I just lay there, staring at the door, my breath caught in my throat. The whispering continued, growing louder, more insistent, until I could feel it vibrating in the very walls of the house. Sarah. Sarah. It was coming from the hallway just beyond my door, and I knew, deep down, that no one was there. It felt wrong, like an intrusion. I had to do something, but my body refused to move. I was paralyzed with fear. The whispers persisted, becoming more frantic, as if urging me to come closer. My mind raced. Who could it be? Who would be whispering to me in the dead of night? I slowly forced myself to sit up in bed, my heart hammering in my chest. I couldn't just sit here and listen to the voice. I had to confront it, had to see what was on the other side of that door. With a deep breath, I stood up and crept toward the door, my footsteps silent on the old wooden floor. The whispers stopped suddenly, and an eerie silence filled the air. I hesitated for a moment, hand on the doorknob, unsure if I was truly ready to face whatever was on the other side. But I knew I had no choice. I had to see for myself. I slowly opened the door and stepped into the hallway, my eyes scanning the darkness. The house was quiet now, too quiet. The whispers had stopped, but the air felt thick with something malevolent. The hallway stretched out before me, dimly lit by the faint glow from the stairwell at the end. The shadows seemed to stretch and twist, almost as if they were moving on their own. My skin prickled with unease, but I pressed on, my feet carrying me down the hall, my eyes never leaving the shadows. The house creaked underfoot as I moved deeper into the darkness, the silence now pressing in on me like a heavy weight. Every instinct screamed at me to turn back, to get out of this house and never look back. But I couldn't. I had to know. The whispers returned, but this time they weren't calling my name. Instead, they were murmuring, too quiet to make out the words, but they were unmistakable. They were coming from the living room. I turned the corner into the open space, my heart racing in my chest. The room was empty, save for the old furniture and the dim light from the fireplace. But something was wrong. The air felt heavier here, thick with an oppressive energy. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to pulse, and I could feel my breath hitching in my throat. Then I saw it. In the far corner of the room, near the large window that overlooked the backyard, there was a figure standing in the darkness. It was tall and hunched, its form almost blending into the shadows. For a moment I couldn't move, I couldn't breathe. I could only stare, my body frozen in place. The figure didn't move. It didn't make a sound. It simply stood there, its face obscured by the darkness. And then it spoke. "Sarah?" The voice came again, low and guttural, the same whisper from earlier, but this time it was unmistakably close, as if it were right next to me. The sound sent a jolt of panic through my body, and I backed away, my mind reeling. My feet scrambled to find traction on the floor as I tried to retreat, but my legs felt weak, like I was being pulled toward the figure. "Sarah, come closer," the voice whispered again, and this time I could feel its presence. A cold, clammy feeling that wrapped itself around me like a vice. I turned and ran, my heart pounding in my chest. The sound of my feet slapping against the floor was deafening in the silence as I bolted down the hall, through the door, and into my room. I slammed the door behind me, locking it with trembling hands, and collapsed on the floor, gasping for breath. The whispers stopped. The figure was gone, but the air still felt thick, suffocating. I knew I hadn't imagined it. Whatever had been in that house was real, and it was still there. I stayed in my room for hours, wide awake, the events replaying over and over in my head. Was it just a hallucination? Was I imagining the whole thing? The shadows in the living room, the figure that had whispered my name, the oppressive atmosphere in the house, it was all too real. Yet, there had been no sign of anyone else. No footsteps, no creaks from the floorboards, nothing to indicate that someone else had been in the house with me. And yet, the feeling of being watched, of something lurking in the dark corners of the house, only intensified. I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever had been in that room was still there, somewhere in the house waiting for me. I was afraid to sleep, afraid that if I closed my eyes, the whispers would return, or worse, that the figure would appear again, standing in the shadows, calling my name. I could feel it, deep down in my gut. The house wasn't empty. It wasn't just old and creaky. It was haunted. But by what? By who? The questions kept swirling in my mind, and no matter how much I tried to push them away, I couldn't. I needed answers. The next morning, I decided to leave the house. I didn't care about my parents' excitement or their reassurances that everything was fine. I needed to get out. But when I went downstairs to grab my things, I realized something. The house was completely silent. It wasn't just the quiet of a house with no people. It was an unnatural silence. Even the usual sounds of the old house, the creaks of the floors, the hum of the pipes, the wind outside, were gone. The air was heavy with a stillness that was almost suffocating. I stepped out of my room, my footsteps echoing on the wooden floors, and I made my way down the stairs. The walls of the house seemed to close in on me, the darkness pressing closer with each step I took. As I reached the bottom of the stairs, I heard something. A faint sound, almost like a whisper, but so soft that it was barely audible. I froze. My heart skipped a beat and I held my breath, listening intently. The whispering was back. It was coming from the living room again, but this time it was different. It wasn't just one voice. It was multiple voices, overlapping, murmuring in a language I didn't understand. The whispers seemed to swirl around me, filling the space, growing louder and louder with each passing second. I wanted to run. I wanted to leave, to get out of that house before it consumed me. But my legs wouldn't move. I stood there, rooted to the spot, as the whispers grew into a maddening cacophony. The voices weren't just whispering anymore. They were calling to me. They were beckoning me toward the living room. "Come closer," they urged. "Come see us. Sarah." The words were cold, sharp, like nails scraping against a chalkboard, and they made my blood run cold. There was no escape. No matter how much I wanted to run, to scream, I was trapped. I could feel something pulling me, tugging at my very soul, and before I knew it, my feet were moving, taking me toward the living room against my will. I tried to resist, tried to turn around, but my body wouldn't listen. I felt like a puppet on a string, drawn forward by some unseen force. As I reached the doorway to the living room, I saw it again, the figure. It was standing in the same spot as before, just beyond the shadows, its tall form looming in the darkness. But this time, there was something different about it. It wasn't just standing there anymore. It was moving. Slowly, methodically, it turned its head toward me, and its eyes, if they could be called eyes, glowed faintly in the darkness, like twin pools of liquid black. "Sarah," it whispered again. But this time its voice wasn't soft or distant. It was close, so close I could feel its breath on my skin. I backed away, my legs shaking beneath me, but the figure didn't move. It just stood there, watching. Me with its unblinking eyes, its mouth stretched into a twisted grin. "You shouldn't have come here," it said, its voice a rasping whisper. "You're mine now." I turned to run, but before I could take a single step, the door slammed shut behind me. I spun around, my heart racing, my breath coming in shallow gasps. But there was no escape. The room felt smaller, the walls pressing in, and the air grew thicker, suffocating. The figure didn't move from its spot. It was like it was waiting for something, waiting for me. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. My throat was dry, my voice stolen by the fear that had lodged itself deep within me. The whispers intensified, now joined by low growls and guttural moans that echoed through the room, bouncing off the walls. The house was alive with sound, and it was all directed at me. I stumbled backward, tripping over the edge of the rug and falling to the floor. As I scrambled to my feet, I looked up, and that's when I saw it. Another figure, this one, standing near the window, bathed in a sickly pale light. It was taller than the first, its body gaunt and skeletal, its limbs twisted and elongated. It stared at me with hollow eyes, and its lips curled into a horrific smile. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. The figures seemed to close in on me, the room filling with the sound of their raspy, uneven breaths. I knew I was trapped. There was no way out. And then, in a voice that chilled me to the bone, the first figure spoke again. How you shouldn't have come here, Sarah. Now you're part of this house, part of us. The room went dark and everything went silent. I couldn't see, couldn't hear, couldn't breathe. And then I was falling. It was supposed to be just a quick overnight stay at a random roadside hotel. I'd been driving for hours, tired from a long journey, and I was eager to rest for the night. The GPS led me to a small, somewhat worn hotel, the kind that had seen better days but seemed decent enough for a night of sleep. The sign outside flickered intermittently, and the parking lot was nearly empty, which I thought was odd for a place on a busy highway. Still, it was late, and I needed a place to crash, so I pulled into the lot. The building itself was old, with peeling paint and a faint smell of mildew in the air, but I figured it was just a result of age and neglect. The lobby was dimly lit, and the air was thick with the scent of stale carpet and cleaning supplies. The desk clerk was a man in his late 40s, graying at the temples, his eyes tired as though he hadn't slept in days. His voice was raspy when he greeted me, and he handed me a key with a crooked smile. "Room 219, he said, his gaze lingering, on me just a bit too long. I took the key without much thought, paid for the night and headed to my room. The hallways were eerily quiet, save for the occasional creak of the floorboards under my feet. As I walked to room 219, I noticed that the hotel seemed unusually cold, the air almost unnaturally crisp. When I reached the door, I couldn't help but feel a chill run down my spine. The door itself was heavy, and when I turned the handle, it felt like something was resisting from the inside. I pushed it open and stepped into the room. It was small, dimly lit, and smelled faintly of mothballs. The furniture was old, but it appeared functional. An aging armchair by the window, a desk with an old lamp, and a bed covered in a floral patterned comforter that seemed as though it had been there for decades. I set my bags down and went to the bathroom to freshen up. When I returned, I sat on the bed intending to relax before bed, but something felt off. I couldn't quite place it at first, but the atmosphere in the room felt thick, like there was something lingering in the air. The silence was oppressive, almost suffocating. I tried to shake the feeling off, chalking it up to the tiredness of my long drive, but as I settled in, a strange sensation washed over me. I began to feel watched, like someone or something was observing me from the shadows. It was only then that I noticed the mirror on the far wall, opposite the bed. It was large, framed with dark wood, and the surface was slightly fogged, as though it hadn't been cleaned in ages. I couldn't take my eyes off it. The reflection seemed off. For a moment, I thought I saw a shadow move in the corner of the room behind me, but when I turned around, the room was still, the only movement coming from the flickering light overhead. I stood up, walked over to the mirror and wiped away the fog. As I did, the temperature in the room seemed to drop, and I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. When I looked into the mirror again, something had changed. There, just behind me in the reflection, was a figure, tall, thin, and completely black, as though it were made from darkness itself. Its face was a blur of shifting shadows, and though I couldn't see its eyes, I felt them on me, piercing through me. My breath caught in my throat, and I turned around quickly, but the room was empty. I whipped my head back to the mirror, but the figure was gone. I felt dizzy, my heart pounding in my chest, but I told myself it was just my imagination. I had been driving for hours after all, but as I turned away from the mirror, I felt a cold hand, icy and unnatural, brush against the back of my neck. I spun around, but no one was there. There was nothing but the silence of the room and the distant hum of the building's old air conditioning unit. My mind was racing. Was I imagining things? Was I just exhausted from the drive? I tried to shake it off, but something inside me told me I wasn't alone. As I sat back on the bed, the air grew heavier, the room colder, and then I heard it. A soft tapping sound. It was faint at first, like someone lightly knocking on a door in the distance, but it grew louder, closer, until it sounded like someone was knocking on the door of my room. My heart skipped a beat. I stood up and walked cautiously to the door, my hand trembling as I reached for the doorknob. When I opened it, the hallway was empty. No one was there. no sounds. Nothing but the low hum of the building's ancient heating system. I stood there for a moment, trying to calm myself. I closed the door and locked it, then leaned against it, still feeling uneasy. I couldn't explain it, but something about this hotel felt wrong. It wasn't just the atmosphere. It wasn't just the cold or the strange feeling that I was being watched. It was something deeper, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. The knocking started again, this time louder, more insistent. My breath hitched in my throat and I looked toward the window. The room was still dark, but I swore I saw movement outside. There was no way anyone could be out there at this hour, but the shadows outside the window were shifting, undulating. I couldn't explain it, but I couldn't stay in this room any longer. I grabbed my bags and made my way back to the lobby, but as I stepped out into the hallway, the lights flickered and I felt the temperature drop again. The knocking continued, now louder than ever. I was being drawn back toward room 219, unable to resist. It felt like a force was pulling me, compelling me to return. I turned around and made my way back to the room, my heart pounding with fear. As I entered, the door slammed shut behind me, and the room was filled with an overwhelming darkness deeper than I had ever felt before. The knocking was now joined by whispers, low and guttural, coming from all directions. The darkness in the room seemed to thicken, swirling around me. The figure from the mirror appeared again, standing at the foot of the bed, its face still obscured by shadows, its eyes glowing with a malevolent light. It opened its mouth and whispered my name, its voice like the rustling of dead leaves. "You shouldn't have come here," it said. "You should have left when you had the chance." I could barely breathe. My heart was racing, my chest tight, and the room around me seemed to close in on me, its walls pulsating like the beating of a heart. The figure didn't move, but its presence felt as if it was suffocating me, each breath harder than the last. It repeated my name, this time louder, its voice like a hiss reverberating in my mind and making my knees buckle. "You shouldn't have come here. You should have left when you had the chance." Panic surged through me, but my body felt paralyzed, like I was trapped in some invisible force field, unable to flee. The whispers grew louder, more intense, filling the room with a cacophony of voices. I couldn't understand most of what they were saying, but one word kept repeating over and over, a chilling refrain. "Stay." The word reverberated in my skull, gnawing at my sanity, digging into my thoughts like an infection. Every instinct. I had screamed at me to leave, but my legs felt like they were made of lead. I couldn't move. The figure's shadow stretched across the floor toward me, its outline warping and shifting, impossibly long. A sickly chill crawled up my spine as I fought to take control of my body, to make myself move. But I couldn't. The shadow that had once been a vague silhouette began to take form, growing more solid with each passing second. Its face remained a blur, an indistinct mass of shifting darkness, but I could feel its eyes on me, burning with something more malevolent than I had ever experienced. The figure began to approach me, the ground beneath its feet creaking with each step, as if the room itself were coming to life, responding to its presence. A cold, suffocating wind swept through the room, extinguishing the light in the corner, plunging the space into absolute darkness. I felt the shadow's icy fingers brush my arm, the touch sending a wave of paralyzing dread through me. My breath caught in my throat, and I realized with horrifying clarity that I was no longer alone in the room. The figure was beside me now, and I could feel its presence like an oppressive weight pressing down on my chest. Its voice, now soft and low, whispered again, its words curling around me like tendrils of smoke. "You shouldn't have stayed." I opened my mouth to scream, to beg for help, but nothing came out. My throat was dry, my words trapped inside, swallowed by the suffocating silence. My body trembled uncontrollably as the shadow's figure loomed closer, its form becoming more defined with every passing second. Its face was no longer a blur, but a grotesque mask of twisted features, blackened eyes sunken deep into its skull, and a mouth that hung open in an eternal scream, lined with rows of jagged teeth. I finally managed to move, my legs shaky beneath me as I tried to back away, but I stumbled, falling to the floor. The shadow crouched down beside me, its icy breath cold against my skin. I tried to crawl away, But the moment my hands touched the floor, I felt a sharp pain shoot through my body, as though the very floor itself was rejecting me, forcing me back toward the center of the room. The figure stood over me, its eyes now fixed on me with an intensity that made my blood run cold. I could feel its malevolent energy swirling around me, pressing against my skin, suffocating me with its presence. "You shouldn't have stayed," it repeated, the words now echoing in my mind. "You shouldn't have stayed." The whispers grew louder again, filling my head, drowning out everything else. It was as though the very walls were closing in on me, the air thick with an oppressive force that I couldn't escape. Panic surged through me, but I could still barely move. It was as if my body had become part of the darkness, slowly becoming one with the room, with the entity that now surrounded me. I looked around desperately, my mind racing for a way out, but there was nothing. There was no escape. The door was shut tight, the windows sealed shut with heavy curtains that I couldn't see past. I was trapped in this room with whatever had been waiting for me. And then suddenly the knocking started again. It was soft at first, like the tap of a fingernail against the wood, but it grew louder and faster, filling the room with its rhythmic sound. I couldn't understand what was happening. The knocking was coming from inside the walls now, from the ceiling, from beneath the floor. It surrounded me, reverberating in my skull. My thoughts were spiraling out of control, each one becoming more twisted and fragmented. The figure crouched down in front of me again, its face inches from mine, its foul breath hot against my skin. "Stay," it hissed, its voice like nails scraping across glass. "Stay with me forever." I closed my eyes tightly, trying to block out the figure, the knocking, the whispers. I couldn't escape. I couldn't fight it. The room had become a prison, and I was its unwilling occupant. The shadows closed in on me, swallowing me whole until there was nothing left but the darkness, the whispers, and the relentless knocking. The cold, crisp air of October bit into my skin as I stood before the looming structure of Millfield Mansion. Once a grand estate, it now stood as a decaying relic of its former glory, with vines creeping up the stone walls and broken windows staring out like hollow eyes. I had heard the rumors, the whispers that had followed the mansion for years. It was said to be haunted, its halls filled with restless spirits from a time long past. Yet, despite the warnings, here I was, standing at the front gate, staring into the abyss that would soon become the place of my greatest nightmare. My name is Jack Harlow, an investigative journalist with a passion for the paranormal. I had been tracking ghost stories for years, always searching for that elusive proof of something beyond the veil. This, however, was different. Millfield Mansion was no ordinary haunted house. This place had a reputation, one that had kept even the most seasoned investigators away. But the letter I received a few weeks ago intrigued me beyond reason. It was a formal invitation to explore the mansion, sent from an anonymous source, who claimed to have first-hand knowledge of the eerie occurrences that plagued the estate. The letter promised revelations, stories that would make even the bravest soul shiver. I had to see it for myself. As I approached the mansion's entrance, a sudden gust of wind howled, as if warning me to turn back. The iron gate creaked in, protest as I pushed it open, its screech echoing through the empty estate like a cry for help. The path leading to the front door was overgrown with weeds, and the once pristine stone steps were now cracked and weathered, as though the house had long since abandoned any attempts at self-preservation. My camera, hanging from my neck, swung. With each step I took, I wasn't here to simply observe, I was here to document. The paranormal was my passion, and this mansion promised a story unlike any other. The door loomed before me, an ancient oak with brass handles tarnished by time. I raised my hand, hesitating for just a moment, and then knocked. The sound reverberated throughout the mansion, a deep thud that seemed to linger in the air, hanging as if it were trapped by something unseen. Seconds passed. Then the door creaked open slowly, revealing a dimly lit hallway. The air inside was thick, musty, and stale, the scent of mildew and age clinging to the walls. I stepped forward, my footfall muffled by the thick carpet that stretched out before me. A tall figure appeared at the end of the hallway, a man, or at least something that resembled one. He was tall, thin, with features obscured by the shadows that clung to the corners of the room. "You're the investigator," he said in a voice that was low, almost inaudible. I nodded, swallowing my nerves. "Jack Harlow," I replied. "You sent the invitation." The man's lips curled into what I could only describe as a half-smile, though it never quite reached his eyes. "Welcome to Millfield Mansion," he said, his voice carrying an eerie calm. "I'm glad you've come. You'll see, for yourself, what has been waiting here for so long." With that he turned, his long coat flowing behind him like a dark shadow, and gestured for me to follow. As I entered the mansion, the door creaked shut behind me, the sound sharp and final, as though it were sealing my fate. The air inside was heavy, thick with the weight of forgotten memories and unspoken secrets. The floors groaned beneath my feet, and I could feel the house shifting, as though it were alive, watching, waiting. The man led me deeper into the house, down a long, narrow hallway that seemed to stretch on forever. The walls were lined with faded portraits, each one depicting a member of the Millfield family, their eyes seeming to follow me as I passed. The portraits were unsettling. There was something wrong about the way the figures in them stared, their expressions a mix of sadness and despair. It was as if they were trapped in the canvas, forever bound to this place. We stopped in front of a door at the end of the hall. The man turned to face me. "This is where it all began," he said quietly, "where the curse was set into motion." His words hung in the air, and I felt a shiver run down my spine. He opened the door, revealing a small room. It was dark, the only light coming from a faint flickering candle on a nearby table. The air was thick with dust, and the furniture inside was old, covered with sheets that had long since turned yellow with age. But it wasn't the room itself that caught my attention. It was the symbols etched into the walls, strange, cryptic markings that twisted and spiraled around the room like a maze, each one pulsating with an unnatural energy. As I stepped closer, I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. There was something wrong with this place, something beyond the ordinary, something ancient. "What are these?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. The man's face darkened and he stepped closer to me, his eyes fixed on the symbols. "These are the sigils," he explained, "the markings of the old ones, the ones who came before us. They are the key to everything that has happened here." I could feel the weight of his words settle over me like a shroud, and I suddenly understood that I was standing at the center of something much larger than I had anticipated. Something that had been waiting, hidden in the shadows of this mansion for a very long time. And as I gazed at the symbols, I realized that I had only scratched the surface of the darkness that lurked within Millfield Mansion. The door to the room creaked shut behind me, with a finality that echoed in the emptiness. I stood frozen for a moment, staring at the flickering candle that cast dancing shadows against the walls, the symbols on the stone seeming to twist and change with every passing second. The man, who had yet to introduce himself, stood at the threshold, watching me with an unreadable expression. His silence was heavy, pressing down on me as I took in the dark, suffocating atmosphere that seemed to hang over the mansion. "You don't know what you're dealing with," he said, breaking the silence with a voice that was nearly drowned out by the oppressive air. His words were cold, filled with a sense of warning, but I was no stranger to the paranormal. I'd encountered my fair share of eerie occurrences, unsettling noises and ghostly apparitions, but this felt different. This was something far older, something deeper. "What exactly happened here?" I asked, my voice barely more than a whisper, though I knew, deep down, that I didn't want to know the answer. He took a long, slow breath before stepping into the room, his shadow stretching unnaturally long across the floor. "The house was built upon land that was never meant to be inhabited," he began, his voice carrying an unsettling calmness. "Before the Millfield family came to claim it, the land had been cursed by the original inhabitants, natives who knew of the dark forces that lay beneath the earth. But greed, as it always does, took hold, and the family ignored the warnings. They built the mansion, and in doing so they awoke something ancient, something hungry." He paused, his eyes fixed on the symbols etched into the walls. "It didn't take long for things to go wrong. The family members began disappearing one by one, Some found dead in their beds, others simply vanished without a trace. But the worst part was the whispers, the voices. People would hear them at night, calling from the woods behind the mansion. Some say they were the spirits of the family, lost and tormented, while others believe it was the ancient evil that had been released. I couldn't help but shiver at his words. The air in the room felt thick with the weight of history, as if the walls themselves were holding secrets they were reluctant to share. And you, are you one of them? One of the cursed family members? I asked, trying to piece together what I had learned so far. The man's lips curled into a twisted smile, but there was no humor in it. No, he said, his voice growing colder. I am merely the last remaining soul tied to this house. A witness, if you will, to the horrors that unfolded here. He motioned toward the symbols. These markings, they are what hold the curse in place. They were drawn to seal the evil within, to keep it from escaping, but they have weakened over the years. The spirits are restless. They are trying to break free. I swallowed hard, feeling a lump form in my throat. What do you want me to do? I asked, suddenly feeling very small in this decaying mansion. The man's eyes narrowed, and for the first time, I noticed a flicker of something like fear in his gaze. I want you to leave, he said, his voice now sharp and insistent. No one should stay here. No one should ever come here. But it was too late. I had already crossed the threshold, and the door had already closed behind me. I could feel the weight of the house pressing in from all sides, like it was alive, watching, waiting for something, waiting for me. The silence that followed his words felt suffocating. I could hear my own breath, shallow and rapid, as I turned to face the man again. I can't leave, I said, more to myself than to him. I need to find out what happened here. I need to know the truth. The man stared at me for a long moment before nodding slowly. Then you will see it, he said quietly, almost too quietly. But remember, not everything that happens here can be undone. His words hung in the air like a dark promise, and I knew then that there was no turning back. As the night stretched on, I found myself growing restless. The shadows seemed to lengthen, and the candle's light flickered more violently, as though it were fighting to hold on. The man who had invited me here seemed to fade into the background, his presence growing more and more distant with each passing minute. But I couldn't ignore the feeling of being watched. It was as if the house itself was alive, alive with memories of the past, alive with the suffering of those who had lived and died within these walls. I wandered the mansion in search of answers, my footsteps echoing eerily through the empty hallways. The portraits on the walls seemed to leer down at me, their eyes following my every move. In one hallway I stumbled upon an old staircase leading up to the second floor. The stairs creaked under my weight, and the further I climbed, the more oppressive the air became. At the top of the stairs, I entered a long hallway lined with closed doors. Each door looked identical, a faded wooden panel with a brass knob that had long since tarnished. But as I passed one door, something caught my attention. A faint sound, almost imperceptible. It was a soft whispering noise, like a faint murmur coming from behind the door. I stopped in my tracks, my heart racing. The sound grew louder, more distinct, until it was a clear, unmistakable voice. "Help me." The words were barely audible, but I heard them nonetheless, clear as day. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I found myself reaching for the door handle before I even realized what I was doing. My hand trembled as I gripped the knob, and with a deep breath I turned it. The door opened slowly, and I stepped inside. What I found was a room unlike any other in the mansion. It was a child's room, decorated with faded wallpaper, and a single old-fashioned bed covered with a patchwork quilt. But it was empty, completely empty, save for a single object in the center of the room. A small, cracked porcelain doll sat on the floor, its glassy eyes staring up at me. As I knelt down to pick it up, I felt a sudden cold gust of wind sweep through the room, slamming the door shut behind me. The whispers returned, louder this time, a chorus of voices that seemed to call my name. My skin crawled as I stood up, clutching the doll in my hands. I knew that I needed to get out of this room, but before I could reach the door, I heard it. A sound, unmistakable and chilling. Footsteps. Someone or something was coming. And it wasn't just the wind.